Okay, we will continue with cross for Dr. Varadarajan. Nobody else flipped the R like that, did they? All right, one question, sir. We can't find this chart in the exhibits, and we just wanted to make sure, see if y'all wanted to enter that chart as an exhibit.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We would, I guess, request that chart be entered into the record as the next.
Okay, we will enter that in as exhibit number 97. Okay, commissioners' questions. Commissioner Whitfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Varadarajan, good to have you with us.
Thank you.
You heard, I think you might have been in the room when I asked former Commissioner Benz about securitization of the company's NND abandonment costs, and we talked about the ownership here in South Carolina, how Santee Cooper, a public power partner owned by the state of South Carolina, owns 45%. In your opinion, who, under this type scenario where you create a special purpose entity or special purpose vehicle, in your mind, does title of that asset transfer to the special purpose entity, or how does that work? I would like to hear from your answer as well, since this is your testimony.
So, again, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't want to opine too deeply beyond what I can say about the regulatory asset. The special purpose vehicle does indeed gain in the transaction, is now the owner of the residual regulatory asset, which represents the remaining balance of the total NND costs that continue to have been allowed or for cost recovery. The primary asset, that being said, the primary asset that the special purpose vehicle has that actually has future cash flows associated with it is actually the rights to collect the future ratepayer rider revenues, which is really fundamentally, from the point of view of a bond holder, the real valuable property that has been transferred over to the special purpose vehicle. That is, there's some rider that would be approved if securitization is used. There are some future revenues that are coming from that rider that are expected to arise as a result of that rider on ratepayer bills for the next 20 years in the case of a 20-year securitization. And that is the asset that is being securitized and turned into a bond and is the primary source of value that's remaining associated with the transaction.
Okay, thank you for that answer. I may be getting a little bit out of your purview again, but there are tremendous tax implications here, both income tax-wise, as you know, SC&G seeking federal tax credits for a large amount. Then you also have, back to the ownership issue, you have potential property tax issues depending on the ownership. So would you opine on the tax implications, or is that out of your?
Again, unfortunately, it is a bit out of I would defer to a lawyer on that issue. All I can say is that in general, if the special purpose vehicle is fully consolidated, it's a subsidiary of the utility. In principle, the tax implications of that regulatory asset are still passed through to the parent. And so even if, however, I again, for modeling purposes, the assumption we made was that the tax implications and the tax benefits and costs associated with the regulatory asset continue to remain with the company and were still part of the impact that the asset had on rate base. However, I'm not an expert on that issue.
Thank you. And last question, it's kind of a two-part question. I think you heard in your testimony, and I heard you say on the stand that securitization would have an, I'm going to put words in your mouth. I don't think you said the word adverse, but negative or adverse impact on the company, but not to the point of bankruptcy or not to the point of, not to the point of bankruptcy. And then the last question, if you could just answer that one, and also this commission, given the fact we're not a lawmaking body, could put in the order that would be a securitization, could be a tool in the future, should the legislature choose to go down that path. Because I think we did hear testimony that securitization doesn't necessarily have to be done now. It could be done way down in the future, I think was some of the testimony we heard. So I guess if you could answer those, the adverse impacts, both for the company if the merger did not go through, and if the merger did go through, and also what your thoughts are on what this commission could do in a final order as it relates to securitization.
Sure. I should clarify that in the scenarios that I considered that are listed there, I did not see adverse impacts to the company's credit rating from securitization. So that is, for the purposes of its credit rating, depending on how the proceeds are used, the company could see roughly similar credit rating to the one it has currently, to potentially a positive credit rating impact. And this is consistent with Commissioner Binz's testimony from the Moody's report, which generally speaking views securitization as a credit positive event for a company, particularly in a situation where it has a large regulatory asset. The idea is that that reduces regulatory risk associated with a very large regulatory asset on its books, which may be disallowed in the future.
So you're completely on the positive end, and I didn't mean to put that word adverse in your mouth, but somewhere I got a negative connotation in your testimony.
Yes, and the distinction here, you're right, Commissioner Whitfield. The place where there could be a negative implication is for shareholders, which is to say that shareholders, after securitization, no longer would be earning an equity return on the balance of that regulatory asset. And again, that can be mitigated by reinvestment, where we think there's an opportunity for the company still to reinvest the proceeds. Apologies on the second question. Indeed, securitization, as Commissioner Binz mentioned, could be done now. It could be done later. However, the benefits are one of the primary benefits of securitization is avoiding near-term costs associated with cost recovery and return on capital to the utility that customers would be paying on the regulatory assets. So the benefits would be greater the more rapidly.
So you're saying do it while the debt is higher.
That's right. Do it. It would be beneficial to customers, more beneficial to customers now if it's done earlier, of course. But it still has benefits if it's done. It's certainly most of the benefits if it's done a year from now, for example, or 2 years from now.
Well, thank you for your testimony. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Elam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. You were speaking of Mr. Benz's testimony. Do you have a copy of that?
I don't have it in front of me, but I will try to remember as best as I can.
On page 20 and 21 of his direct testimony, he lists elements for securitization, and Do you see that?
I do. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other elements or suggestions you would add to his list?
No, I don't think so. I think these are the primary elements.
Thank you.
Commissioners, other questions? Ms. Thompson, any redirect?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Just following up on some questions from Dominion's counsel, Mr. Reed. Based on your analysis in this case, is there anything inherent in the securitization of the stranded VC Summer assets that would preclude a merger?
Not that I'm aware of.
Mr. Reed has represented to you in the guise of a question that if the commission requires securitization, Dominion would walk away. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Is your understanding that the reason for that is that the company would rather earn an equity return on a hole in the ground than save SC&G's customers hundreds of millions or even over $1 billion?
I think that's consistent. I think there are securitization offers the company the opportunity to recover that capital and deploy it productively, and particularly if as Commissioner Bin suggested, the Commission was willing to consider ask the company to look for opportunities to reinvest that capital in a way that could allow companies to potentially come up with proposals for building new clean energy that could save ratepayers money. There is an opportunity for the company, in principle, with securitization, to reinvest the capital that was returned to it in ways that could further reduce rates by reducing fuel costs through the use of clean energy. And in many ways, this could be, in my opinion, for the company, a much better alternative that, from Wall Street's perspective, as well as the company's perspective, as a much more productive way for it to earn an equity return by actually doing and investing in capital that can further bring down ratepayer costs and provide clean energy to its ratepayers.
Thank you. That's all I have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Thompson. Any recross on Ms. Thompson's question? Thank you. Okay. Thank you for your testimony, and you may step down and you're excused.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Okay, next witness, please.
Mr. Chairman, we would call Gregory M. Lander. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lander, could you state your full name and business address for the record, please?
Yes. My name is Gregory Lander. My business address is on President Skipping Stone, LLC. My business address is 83 Pine Street, Suite 101, Peabody, Peabody, Mass. 01960.
And by whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I'm employed by Skipping Stone, LLC. I'm the president.
Mr. Lander, did you cause to be pre-filed in this docket 13 pages of direct testimony on September 24th?
I did.
And did you also cause to be pre-filed 9 pages of surrebuttal testimony in these dockets on October 29th?
I did.
Do you have any changes or corrections to either your pre-filed direct or your surrebuttal testimonies?
I do not.
If I asked you those questions here today, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
And did you prepare or cause to be filed 5 exhibits attached to your direct testimony identified as GL1 through GL5?
Yes.
Okay. Are there any corrections or changes to be made to those exhibits?
None that are significant. One letter typo. One.
And were those exhibits either prepared by you or typical of documents relied upon by an expert in your field infirming your opinion?
The answer is yes.
Mr. Chairman, I would move to have the direct, pre-filed, and surrebuttal testimonies of Mr. Lander entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Lander's direct pre-file testimony and pre-file surrebuttal testimony will be entered into the record as though given orally from the stand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would also move to have the 5 exhibits attached to the direct testimony entered into the record as well.
Mr. Lander's 5 exhibits, GL 1 through 5, will be entered as exhibit number 98.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lander, did you prepare a summary of your testimony to be read today?
I did.
Okay, would you please read that for the Commission?
Yes, before I go on, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. And
Well, make sure you get close to that mic. You might want to bend it up a little bit, too, to get towards you. There you go.
I'll start at the beginning.
Much better.
Thank you for the opportunity to come today, speak to you, and to give you the opportunity to ask questions. I've worked in the natural gas business since 1983. That's a 35-year period, and lots changed in that period, both as an employee of natural gas companies and a company that I founded and co-founded, and as an outside consultant. During my career, I've maintained a deep familiarity with a wide range of pipeline transportation issues. I've been my firm's lead principal on 50-plus pipeline and storage merger and acquisition transactions, as well as pipeline and storage greenfield facility expansions. I have those deals have all been for a major pipeline company, which I'm the lead consultant with and helped put into the pipeline business originally by their parent company. Throughout my career, I've filed testimony in multiple dockets at the state and federal level, including several dockets Dominion has opened at Virginia State Corporation Commission. My testimony serves to warn this commission about future risks ratepayers may bear for multi-billion-dollar utility projects that serve and provide ratepayers little to no benefit, but produce massive returns for shareholders. In the wake of the VC summer fiasco, this commission should be particularly wary of the common and increasingly common utility practices that allow them to exploit captive customers. And this is also a recent development in the natural gas market. It hasn't been going on for a long time. It's happened recently. The VC Summer Project illustrates the tendency of investor-owned utilities to use massive power generation projects as drivers of financial returns for utilities, for their shareholders. For investor-owned utilities, this makes complete sense, since the more they invest, the more they get a return on. The goal is to garner as much revenue as the Regulatory Commission will allow. And as the Baseload Review Act also makes clear, where the Commission won't allow such projects, the utilities sponsor legislation to force approval of otherwise doubtful projects. Massive power plant projects, however, are on the decline. Ever since the Great Recession, nationwide electricity consumption has remained flat, or in some places even declined, even as the economy has rebounded significantly. With little excuse to build new power plants, utility holding companies have turned to other types of projects, interstate gas pipelines, supported by customers of gas and electric distribution systems. Both offer significant opportunities for wasteful spending that earns shareholder returns. My testimony focuses on pipelines. In 2014, Dominion Energy, in partnership with Duke and the Southern Company, announced the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which, as proposed, will travel from West Virginia through Virginia into North Carolina. At the time, the utilities claimed that they had already sold roughly 90% of the pipeline's capacity to electric utilities who would use natural gas for power generation. These three utilities, with Dominion as the lead, are exploiting a current regulatory failure at the federal level. When reviewing a proposed new pipeline project, at present, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the FERC, only asks only one question. Has the pipeline developer sold capacity on the pipeline? If so, FERC has approved the project, and often with a guaranteed 14% return on invested equity. FERC conducts no independent analysis of whether these projects are necessary or for the public good, nor does FERC employ any heightened scrutiny when the capacity purchasers are affiliated entities of the pipeline developers. I should note that this is also a concern to the pipeline clients of mine who recognize that this is a competitive impediment to them as well. Over the past 2 years, I've been involved in numerous proceedings, including those at the Virginia State Corporation Commission, digging through the data on Dominion's contract with itself. Through those proceedings, we have discovered several alarming facts. First, Dominion Energy Virginia, that's the utility at the local distribution level, through a wholly owned subsidiary, VPSC, Virginia Power Services, Energy Services Company, or how they call it, signed a multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar capacity contract on the ACP, Atlantic Coast Pipeline, without ever studying whether it needed that capacity for power generation or for fuel to supply power generation. This graphic illustrates the self-dealing nature of that contract. Money came from ratepayers into VPSC. VPSC billed VEPCO, VEPCO paid, VPSC sends the money up to Dominion and down into shareholder pockets. Ratepayers, shareholders, through the capacity agreement. Second, what we discovered was that Dominion never studied fuel delivery alternatives to new firm capacity, such as regasification of LNG at existing facilities and using existing pipeline capacity for delivery of that LNG, or for dual fueling with diesel or kerosene of those generation facilities. Third, Dominion intends to charge its customers 100% of the capacity contract costs, regardless of whether Dominion actually uses the pipeline to fuel its power plants. Fourth, and most concerning, my analysis concludes that the contract will not, as Dominion has claimed, save customers money. In fact, in total, it will cause a net increase, even with potentially favorable gas costs being considered, that increase of between $2.5 and $3 billion over the 20-year period of the contract that Dominion Virginia's customers will pay for a project that is simply not needed. Federal regulatory process with respect to approval of these contracts is broken, and Dominion's stranglehold on the Virginia legislature has meant that their state-level regulators have declined to do anything about it either. But this commission has the opportunity to protect South Carolinians, if I've said that correctly, I hope I have, from similar abuse. I've prepared a detailed report on the subject matter, attached as Exhibit GL2, that reaches several key conclusions. One, there's ample pipeline capacity to serve the needs of SCE&G through at least the winter of 2027-2028. Two, it is not currently economical to build the miles of gas distribution line required to access the load in the PD region. If it were determined to be cost-effective, or this commission determined as a policy matter to expand local natural gas distribution capacity in the PD area, SCE&G and/or Dominion's in-state Dominion Carolina Gas Transmission, DCGT, could be expanded to serve this region without any need, and this is the key, for any additional out-of-state, interstate natural gas supply. I noted in my direct testimony that Transco had intervened in this docket. Transco is Transcontinental Gas Pipeline. It's the largest natural gas pipeline in America. It runs basically from South Texas to New York City and runs through South Carolina. And it's one of the dominant suppliers to the Carolinas, both South and North Carolina. I noted in my direct testimony that Transco has intervened in this docket, which should alert the Commission to the importance of this issue. I am aware that Dominion and Transco have now settled this case, but my review of the settlement is that it is inadequate to protect ratepayers. The settlement, it's good for the pipeline. It's good for the pipeline competitor. But the settlement requires an RFP, but it provides no oversight of the terms of the RFP or how the RFP is screened. Moreover, the settlement allows SCE&G to sign any new capacity contract as long as the RFP identifies it as least cost. Given the lack of scrutiny the RFP will undergo, this Commission should have no confidence that the RFP's, quote, least cost option is actually least cost. Doesn't consider a no option or a different option. As of November 2, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline is billions of dollars over budget and years behind schedule. That should sound familiar. As ratepayers of this contract, ratepayers of this contract of its contract holders, ratepayers of the utilities that hold the contracts, will pay for it regardless. I hope this sounds familiar to the Commission. It may be too late to save Virginia. That's not this Commission's job anyway. But the Commission can and should protect South Carolina from a similarly imprudent investment by SCE&G in the future. If the Commission approves the merger, it should do so, or should only do so, by imposing a requirement that SCE&G first engage in a needs analysis in a public proceeding before this Commission to identify demand, including analysis of the demand's seasonal and load factor characteristics. Second, the utility must undertake a comparative cost analysis of meeting that identified demand with extension or expansion of SCE&G services and facilities, including cost-effective demand-side management and energy efficiency, and utilization of its and others' available peaking facilities. In this public proceeding, interested parties should have the opportunity to evaluate and comment on the needs and comparative cost analysis, and this Commission should review the analysis and ensure that they are accurate and that intervener criticisms are taken into account where appropriate. Next, should the character of the identified demand cost-effectively warrant additional fuel supplies, the Commission should require a public, transparent, delivered gas and/or pipeline capacity procurement process, possibly involving a competent third-party evaluator, reviewers, report to this Commission to ensure that the utility does not unreasonably commit its customers to billions of dollars in unjustified costs. Essential to this procurement process would be solicitation of parties with capacity on Transco and other pipelines that are able to deliver to DCGT for SCE&G, to the pipeline in the state for the distribution company in the state. And that those proposals should include firm delivered gas proposals to meet the identified need. The reason for this delivered gas portion of the solicitation is that there are parties with capacity, especially on Transco, which can deliver to DCGT for SCE&G using existing capacity that could be contractually committed to the particular identified demand needs of SCGE&E. Finally, the Commission should condition its merger approval on getting a binding commitment from DCGT, from the pipeline, that it will undertake SCE&G requested expansions and or extensions of the DCGT system to enable SCE&G to undertake fulfillment of the results of the SCE&G procurement process. It's not, no pipeline is required to make a particular expansion or extension, even if they're asked for it by a customer, even if the customer says they will do it. Pipeline has to approve it. So what we're saying here is that DCGT be making a commitment that if SCE&G does request an expansion or extension of DCGT, that's obviously compensatory to DCGT, that DCGT would undertake it. In addition, as a general requirement, this commission should also impose carefully crafted regulatory conditions on any merger that ensure vigorous, ongoing oversight of affiliate transactions. Such ongoing oversight could involve the requirement that affiliate transactions, either individually or in aggregate exceeding some commission-defined monetary and or duration threshold, be subject to a public RFP and bidding process. That would be obviously a review prior to entering into the contract as opposed to post hoc review. That concludes my summary.
Thank you, Mr. Lander. Mr. Chairman, you gave me permission yesterday to do very limited live rebuttal to address Rose Jackson's testimony that was filed yesterday. I'd do that now if that's permissible.
Okay.
May I first have a little water?
Yes.
Great.
Mr. Lander, yesterday the joint applicants filed the settlement testimony of Rose M. Jackson on behalf of SCE&G. Did you read that testimony?
I briefly reviewed it last night, yes.
I have a few questions about that. This is page 5, where Ms. Jackson is responding to Mr. Alator's testimony, where he states that the combined companies could, and this is the underlined piece on page 4, lines 10 through 12, the combined companies could exert significant control over electricity and natural gas supplied to South Carolina. Do you agree with this statement that the combined companies could have significant control over this?
Yes.
On page 7 of her testimony, lines 2 through 4, Ms. Jackson is stating that the company should not be required to do a least cost analysis when procuring capacity, and this is therefore such a least cost standard is neither reasonable nor practical in practice and would not allow SC&G reasonable flexibility to prudently pursue the optimal resources for the benefit of the customers. Do you agree with that statement?
It's almost laughably wrong.
Okay, would you explain why that's wrong?
First of all, that sort of process happens in probably 48 or 49 states in the country. And least cost generally isn't the first consideration. It's the last consideration. It's the final consideration after you've done apples-to-apples comparisons. You've identified a need. You've identified ways to meet that need. There are bids to meet that need, that now predefined and well-defined need. And then there are going to be alternative ways to meet that need, one of which will cost the least. And so the statement here appears to put least cost first before there's other considerations that are approved and understood and recognized. And so the reason it's laughable is because nobody does that. Nobody says, let's go least cost first and then figure out if it meets the need. So what you do is you define the need, identify the different ways that need can be met, and then based upon apples-to-apples comparisons, you make a least cost determination of the means of meeting that identified need.
So you make a recommendation in your testimony that the company should implement a certain practice. Does that practice take into account flexibility?
Absolutely.
And does it take into account optimal resourcing evaluation?
Certainly would.
And does it take into account time of need?
That's very critical.
And does it take into account reliability?
A priori, yes.
Lastly, Ms. Jackson states that the settlement between Transco and the joint applicants is fair and reasonable. This is line 13. From the ratepayer perspective, do you think this settlement is fair and reasonable?
It misses some key considerations, and it's a great deal, if you will, between Transco, a competitor of Minions, because it basically says, as between the two entities that might get an investment opportunity, it levels the playing field. But that doesn't do anything for ratepayers, because neither of those entities have as a primary raison d'etre, providing ratepayer benefits. And so it should be what the proposal they're talking about in the settlement should be the last piece, and then a good piece. But the first should become an assessment of the need, identification of the contours of that need, and the ways to meet that need. And then, if the need is determined to be best met by additional facilities of a pipeline nature, fine. Then the RFP process that they call for should go forth. So it's a necessary but by no means sufficient condition for ratepayers in South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Lander. The witness is available for cross. And, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the indulgence letting me do that rebuttal live.
Okay. Cross, Mr. Guild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Lander. No questions at this time.
ORS.
Good morning or good afternoon, Mr. Lander. Annette Edwards on behalf of the Office of Regulatory Staff. You were talking about that the Commission needs to put in place safeguards to protect the ratepayer, in particular to protect the ratepayer from self-dealing. Can you take a moment and just kind of describe what you mean by self-dealing and how that could occur?
Sure. Recently, I'd say the last 2 to 5 years, concentrating in the last 3 to 4, what we've seen is economic entities that own a series of regulated assets, interstate pipelines, gas distribution companies, electric distribution companies, and other assets, have basically put in place contracts between state-regulated distribution, either electric or gas or both, entities, and pipeline companies that are all owned by the same holding company. And these contracts have not gone through, while they call a quote open season, what they have not done is they've had an open season after the contracts between the two regulated entities of the same parent company have entered into the contract. They didn't have an open season at the beginning or an RFP process at the beginning before that contract was signed. And so the self-dealing happens when the chairman of both companies basically is responsible for saying, you state-regulated entity, sign a contract with you federally regulated entity. And where we've seen this happen is in states where the state-regulated entity is not required to get prior approval of contracts. And so we haven't seen it happen in places like Massachusetts or Pennsylvania, and some of those other states, maybe even Ohio is another one. But we have seen it in Virginia. We've seen it in Missouri. Where else did I see it? I believe it was. I'm going to draw a blank, so I'm not going to argue.
Take time.
But definitely in those two places. And so that self-dealing basically means that the state-regulated entity puts in its fuel, or is proposing, will put in its fuel recovery proceedings, recover those capacity contracts. The ratepayer dollars come into the utility, go through the contract, up to the pipeline company, and then down to shareholders. And so that self-dealing is what we believe should be safeguarded against, that practice which has come about recently.
Thank you for that explanation. do you have, you mentioned recommended safeguards. Could you explain what safeguards specifically that you are seeking this commission to adopt in this proceeding?
I could generate language, but in words, it would be that you have a process where a need is identified by the utility, and a timing of that need, and an incidence of that need. In other words, what does that need happen 365 days a year? Does it happen 5 days a year, 10 days a year? What's the occurrence of that need? And then that if that need is for power for customers, let's say, are there different ways to provide that power? Can that power be provided by demand response, by storage, by new generation, by what are the different ways that power could be provided, or meeting that, either lowering the demand or meeting that demand. Once that, so if it's on the power side, you do that, and they say, okay, here's the need that we've identified. Give me proposals to provide that need or meet that need. And that would be a process, an RFP process. So you have an open needs assessment process followed by an RFP process. If it were on just the gas side, then you do almost the same thing. You say, okay, where is this gas demand? What does the contours of this gas demand look like? What are the different means of meeting this gas demand? Is there gas demand response that could do it? And if not, what are the different supply sources, including infrastructure and supply, that could meet this identified demand? Once that identified demand has been vetted and identified, then it's like on the electric side, you go through an RFP process that would meet that. And then the decision as to whether or not the utility purchases and adds to rate base the means of meeting that, or purchases by contract and it's an expense, can all be decided between you, the utility, and the vendor of the response. In other words, it's not to favor contract over investment, but it's to basically identify the least cost method of meeting, and I previously identified and approved demand, new need.
If the merger was to go through, would the safeguard that you just described, would that make rates higher than they otherwise would be if this safeguard was adopted?
No, the whole purpose would be to either make them the same or, well, it would not in and of itself make rates higher. If an investment were to occur because of this process and that caused rates to go up, then yes, it would go up. But the question is, would it go up less than they might otherwise? The idea is that rates would reflect correct price signals accurately conveyed between buying and selling parties.
You're just trying to make sure that whatever investment is made, that it is not made in a self-dealing manner and is in fact it's basically at a cost that would be most favorable to the ratepayer.
Yes, and that's determined up front, and it also gives investment certainty to the utility that doesn't otherwise exist.
Okay. You mentioned in your testimony the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, the ACP, and of course there's been speculation about the ACP being extended into South Carolina. Do you see that SC&G ratepayers would ultimately be paying the cost of such an ACP extension?
Well, let's first say if ACP gets built, it does get completed, and there's an economic driver to bring ACP into South Carolina, there should be no reason why, let's say there's some end users or power generators who want to sell power in South Carolina, who want gas. They could sign up for that capacity to move to build an extension of ACP into South Carolina. The purpose of having this needs analysis followed by RFP is so that it's not to prevent the pipeline or a pipeline from being built, but it's to make sure that should it happen, it's the least cost way of meeting that demand. So, for instance, if a generator or a large industrial customer like those who have signed up for capacity with DCGT in the latest expansion wanted to bring ACP to their locations, they could sign up for capacity with DCGT. Wouldn't affect SC DN ratepayers at all. The only way, so that basically this proposal doesn't impede anybody else's contracting for capacity or building capacity or extending an ACP. It basically says if the contract is to be one from which SCE and G ratepayers are to be responsible, that for making those payments, that they make that the process is open, fair, and transparent from the beginning.
I think you've already addressed this, but just very briefly, you do not believe that the proposed settlement with Transco adequately addresses protections for the SE&G ratepayer.
It's a necessary but not sufficient component.
That concludes my cross-examination. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. Other parties cross. SENG or Dominion?
SENG has no questions of this witness.
None from Dominion either, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Commissioners? Commissioner Whitfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to have you with us, Mr. Lander.
Good to meet you, sir.
You talk about this RFP, your suggestion to put that in a final order, and you're talking about the commission instituting that in its for
the condition.
As a condition for procurement process. Oftentimes, we hear of conflicting or if you will, adverse disputes between federal and state jurisdictions, and with this being a FERC jurisdictional area, you start off at the beginning of your testimony talking about a
broken FERC process.
That's exactly what you called it. I was trying to say it in a little bit more diplomatic way. But
I've
aren't
worked with
you?
them for 30 years, and it's only become broken of late. This part of the process has only become broken of late.
But could the commission become or get itself into trouble, if you will, for stepping in an area that FERC is supposed to have economic regulation of?
That's a very good question, and the reason I say no is as follows. There's definitely times when states and federal commissions are at cross purposes to one another. And 90% of the time that happens, it happens because there are temporal, meaning time-based, differences in decision-making and decision review. And so in the process that I'm talking about, it would be prior to a contract being signed. So it's before there's even something for FERC to review. Okay? So in my view and in my proposal, the process of identifying the need happens prior to there's a contract, prior to there's any document that triggers a federal project or triggers federal review. In other words, before SCE&G would sign a contract that would be used as a precedent agreement, they would have to identify a need, go through a process of getting the need identified and vetted, approved, go through an RFP process. Then and only then would a contract ensue, and that contract would then initiate, potentially, the federal process. And so at that point, you're not at all in conflict with federal process or procedure because you're an antecedent to that even commencing.
So you're saying by requiring this process, that would get it in front of the FERC in a timely manner, for lack of a better word. Is that what you're saying?
Not only a timely manner, but in a manner where all the issues that would otherwise delay the project have been vetted at the state level and passed, and that blessing, so FERC could look at your review, your process, and your blessing.
So you're suggesting a process here too?
Oh, yes, yes. I'm suggesting that the need that the facility would meet be identified here at the state level through an open process, that need then would be identified how it could be met, what are the different ways it could be met, and then among the ways that it could be met, there would be RFPs to generate that meeting of that demand. If an RFP were then approved by this commission, or a contract was resulted from that RFP process, then from which a contract would ensue. That contract would be, in the case of a pipeline project, the precedent agreement that causes a process at the federal level to begin for the certification of that of the pipeline.
So you're talking about both these RFPs for both contract purposes and for new assets, new infrastructure.
You could do it. You could either have the RFP would either, I guess in my view, would either result in the contract for the service over existing facilities, let's say, or the contract for infrastructure through which service would be provided. It could be both, but it's generally going to be one or the other, because generally speaking, you either have someone bringing you an FOB type contract, I'll give you gas delivered to you here, or they bring you a proposal that says, I'll bring you capacity delivered here and you get your own gas. So so what I'm talking about is the RFP would result in one or the other of those outcomes.
Well, you know, there's already been a good bit of debate about that here already, as Transco was allowed intervention in here on appeal and by a rehearing of this matter by this commission. So, and you do seem to be, I guess, somewhat, trying to choose my words carefully, somewhat appreciative of the settlement that's out there, but what you're saying is we need to go you're suggesting a step further with this RFP.
Right. I'm essentially asserting that it's, as I've said, a necessary condition, right? But it is not sufficient, because it presumes that there is a need to be met. And what I'm saying is, part of the problem we see is the presumption of the need being met is where the problem initiates, because there isn't a demand or the means of meeting the demand, or a demand, is presumed, as opposed to, let's look at what is the demand. Is the demand for meeting residential load for this new 30,000 customers that get added? What is the characteristics of a residential load? A residential load is very highly peaked a few days a year and very low the rest of the year. So if the need is for, let's say, 30,000 residents in the South, that'd be, if like, say, 40,000 a day, 40,000 decatherms a day for 6 days in the winter, and then 30,000 customers at 2,500 decatherm a day the rest of the year. Well, is it economical to meet that 40,000 decatherm load for 6 days with a project that you pay for 365 days? Or should you build a project of, say, 10,000 and provide the additional 30,000 that you need out of the LNG facilities of Bushy and Sally? Or should you maybe expand Bushy and Sally storage and vaporization to solve that needle peak need? And so once you identify the need, that begins to tell you, and the contours of that need, it begins to tell you what is the best mixture of supply and assets to meet that need. And I was speaking there just on the gas side, just as an example. And so the reason you put the needs analysis first is because it tells you if there's an infrastructure piece, if there's a pipeline infrastructure piece, what's the magnitude of that piece? And what will be the utilization of that piece? And so if you build 40,000 and you use it only 6 days a year, and you use 3,000 or 2,000 the rest of the year, it's going to be an extraordinarily low load factor, very high unit cost. Whereas if you build, say, 10,000 to meet that same demand, you sell interruptible on the distribution, on the utility for between 6 and 10, you fill the difference between 10 and 30 with LNG, you have a much higher utilization of the 10,000 and the less cost per unit. And so that becomes a more effective and efficient way of meeting that overall need.
You just described some of our assets and volumes in very detailed manner here in South Carolina, and what I'm hearing you say loud and clearly is FERC does not
look at those.
Yes, sir. Thank you. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lander, happy to have you with us, sir.
Nice to meet you, sir.
I'm from the PD, so help me.
All right, okay.
Make sure you get close to that mic, Commissioner.
We'll try. Do our best. Okay, Mr. Lander, the project for the Atlantic Coast Pipeline now is a pipeline that comes through West Virginia, Virginia, North Carolina, and
stops in Lumberton, about 12 miles from the border. Yeah.
Right, it does. And that project, if it were to be expanded into South Carolina, would have to be a new docket before PERC, wouldn't it?
That's correct.
And the new docket would have no responsibility for the expense of putting the pipeline in these other states, is it?
That's not necessarily true, sir.
Okay, how would you avoid that?
Well, if you have a moment, I'm going to try and say it very simply and give me a minute.
Yes, sir.
Depending on the cost of an expansion, the incumbent pipeline, meaning we'll say it's Dominion here, will either charge an incremental rate, which means that the rate is recovering the costs of just the expansion, and the incremental rate by that definition would have to be higher than the existing rate, because that's the FERC's definition of an incremental rate, is it's higher than the base rate charged under the tariff. And so in that case, anyone taking expansion capacity using an incremental rate would pay a higher rate than the existing rate. So whatever the base rate is to get to Lumberton would set the floor. The incremental rate would be higher. Right now, that base rate, what's called a recourse rate, is under the original cost, meaning under the I think it was under the $4 billion cost. It was $1.79 or $1.76. Costs are now estimated to be $7 billion. So that's not quite a doubling, but let's say it'll cause the $1.76 to go to $2.40 or $2.50. So an incremental rate would have to be $2.50 just for the capacity to be higher, than the $2.40. Or the parent company could say, I'll give you new capacity for the same price. I'll give it to you for the recourse rate, in which case then you become a recourse rate customer. And then any changes in cost, up or down, on the base and the whole pipeline running all the way back to West Virginia would be borne by the new customer, in this case in South Carolina. And the choice is not yours or the subscribers. The choice is the pipelines and the FERC's, because if the cost of the extension per unit is less than the recourse rate, they have to charge you the recourse rate. If it's more than the recourse rate, they have to charge you more. And then and only then would you be, if you're paying more, then and only then could you be insulated from the costs of the rest of the whole system. I hope I explained that in an understandable way.
You did. I'll read it again.
Okay.
Let me ask you another question. Is it not true? Excuse me.
Pardon me, could I guess
Get your mortar man.
I'll be happy to get it myself, but thanks.
Let me ask you, if I could, Mr. Lander.
Certainly.
Is not the gas from the Marcellus Shale much cheaper than the gas now that's being supplied to South Carolina customers?
Not necessarily, no, and here's why. Gas prices, first of all, go up and down, okay, all the time. Gas prices, when they are below a market average, it's because of generally only one thing. There's more gas coming out of the ground than there's pipeline to take it away. And so the producers, all trying to get into that limited space, compete with one another for the buyers that hold the capacity to take it away. And so they keep bidding down the price until somebody else says, I'm not going to take that price. And then that price flows. And that's called a basis blowout. That's when prices get depressed. And we've seen that happen over and over again in my 35 years in the gas business. We saw it happen in the coal bed methane in El Paso, the Rockies. We've seen it in the Barnett Shale. We saw it in the Fayetteville Shale. We've seen it now in the Marcellus and the Utica. And then before we saw it in the Haynesville and the Cotton Valley and the Eagleford. And it always happens. And then when the delta between the price being paid to producers and the value somewhere else is great enough, somebody comes along with an expansion. And as soon as they come along with an expansion, the price at the supply side goes up and the price at the delivery side goes down a little bit, but mostly what happens is it goes up a lot on the supply side. And so what we're seeing right now in 2018, at the end of the year, is now that Atlantic Sunrise has come on stream at 1.7 BCF a day, that's the Transco project, from the Marcellus down to Zone 4, which is basically Georgia. The Nexus project, which is from southwestern Pennsylvania up to Dawn, Ontario. The Rover project from basically the same area to the same area. And the Rockies Express westward expansion and the Columbia Gulf and ANR expansions to the Gulf Coast, all coming out of the same area, have come on stream, that we're now seeing that, quote, favorable price be the same as, or instead of being $1 below Henry Hub, we're now seeing it being 5, 10, 15 cents below Henry Hub, which is basically the cost of fuel to get it from where it is to where the Henry Hub gas can get to. So right now we're seeing these prices equilibrate because the build out of interstate capacity has relieved the depressed or the excess supply areas. So there's one other thing that happens in the pipeline business that causes prices to diverge from an average, and that's when there's too little capacity to a delivery point, like in New York. Like the city of the city of New York has more demand than it has pipeline capacity to fill it. And so what happens when it gets very, very cold in the Northeast, there's more demand in New York than the pipeline can supply. And so just like the producers, when there's too little takeaway capacity, the consumers, when there's too little delivery capacity, bid up because they want to get their piece of that constrained supply. And the reason they keep bidding it up is because in New York City, if you're a consumer who's buying from a third party, from a marketer or a producer, and not from the utility, if you don't come up with the gas, if you don't have the gas, the utility charges you $10 more than the highest price posted in a publication for the gas they sold you. So you're going to pay any price, because if you fail to pay any price, you're going to pay $10 more than that price. And so it drives the price up. So you have prices going down on the supply side when there's too much gas versus takeaway, and you have prices going up on the demand side, on the market side, when there's too little capacity vis-a-vis supply. And then when it happens in New York, that price then influences all the other markets on the East Coast. But the point I'm making, the point you asked was, isn't Marcellus gas cheaper? And the answer is only when there's less pipeline takeaway than there is supply. And now that the pipeline takeaway and supply are balanced, we're seeing that price advantage go away. And long term, what we're seeing in the forwards, what the markets are saying, the forward prices will be, is that the value, the depressed price in the Marcellus may only be 30 to 40 cents below the hub, meaning if it costs you more than 30 or 40 cents to get access to that gas, it's going to cost you more to buy it than it's worth. And if new capacity were to cost $2.50, in our example we talked about earlier, $2.50 doesn't make up for 40 cents even on volume, right? Because it's going to cost you $2.50 every day, and your savings is 40 cents every day. Your net cost is $2.10 every day.
Thank you, sir, very much.
You're welcome.
Commissioners, other questions? Commissioner Irvin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Thanks for your insight. And my question is, could we not have solved this concern of yours about Dominion simply by putting terms in our order that would prevent them from buying from their affiliate?
Well, yeah, but there may be, the point isn't to, I don't mean to spit into this, sorry. The point is not to prevent people from making economic transactions, because there certainly is the potential for economic transactions and synergies and less cost, especially because of the large footprint, if you will, of Dominion, and its possible ability to buy in scale and buy in bulk, or otherwise contract for services where the affiliate relationship can be of benefit to shareholders. So I'm not saying that every affiliate relationship is necessarily bad, and which is what we'd be throwing the proverbial baby out with the bathwater. What I'm saying is, if you have a process where there's evidence in the marketplace where the relationship has not resulted in economic decision making, that we should have this process to prevent that from propagating itself into South Carolina. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying you should prohibit all affiliate transactions, but you should have them pass a muster that starts with identification of need, starts, then assessing and validating that need, then having RFPs to address that need.
So what you're saying is that all self-dealing is not necessarily bad. It could be beneficial to the customer.
Self-dealing has a negative terminology because it's been given that because so many examples have come up, and so procedures have been put in place to prevent uneconomic self-dealing, and then that's been shorthanded into self-dealing because when it's beneficial, they don't call it self-dealing.
What do they call it?
Merger benefits, synergies.
Okay.
When I'm working for my pipeline clients and we're buying something, we tell Wall Street there's synergies associated with the transaction, and those synergies are cost savings and extension of sales to other customers.
I've been trying to get somebody to quantify the benefits of a merger, and nobody's been able to do that yet. Is there a way analytically to determine that, or does it just take time?
I've just licked my thumb, held it up at arm's length, and I've done that. I've had to do it for, let's see now, it's 2018, so it's 19 years. I've had to assist companies in identifying synergies for 19 years. And it's a thumb up at arm's length. But generally, the best place you see synergies are the worst place for South Carolina to look, meaning it's going to be job cuts, it's going to be loss of high-paid corporate management jobs locally. Matter of fact, the first company we bought, my pipeline client, was located in Evansville. No, it was Kentucky, Owensboro, Kentucky, basically across the river from Evansville, and it was the biggest business in Owensboro. Meaning it was, it was like having an insurance company in Columbia, right? A lot of good jobs, a lot of people, and as part of the deal, we got a call from the mayor of Owensboro, begging us to not, shut down the headquarters, and basically we made a commitment that we wouldn't do anything for 3 years, and in the end it was 5 years, but because the next company we bought was located in Houston, that's where all the other pipelines are, and so they had a infrastructure, they had the IT system, they were twice as big in terms of people, and so it just made sense to look for synergies, in fact, out of that deal. And the synergies weren't to cut in the acquired, but to cut in the original business. But when I've done synergy analysis for companies, it's almost always you're looking at the C level and the just below C level, the V level people. Some field, generally not many field, because they're already skinny in the field most places. But that's the first place. The second place you look for synergies are the overlapping assets. Are the assets overlapping so that you can either use fewer field people to look at the same thing, or you can repurpose pipes. So in one of the transactions, the buying pipe was a north to south pipe, and the bought pipe, where they overlapped, was a south to north pipe. And so what we did was we basically integrated those facilities so that we got paid twice to do nothing, meaning the pipe that used to pump to the south, got the gas from the pipe that used to pump to the north, and vice versa. And so the middle of both of them was opened up, and we got paid twice to do nothing. And so that was a definite synergy. And so where facilities overlap, you can identify synergies pretty well. Sometimes, if there's difference in flows for gas, but mostly always it's people, and that's just the unfortunate nature of the business.
So you still think all those safeguards are needed?
Yes, I do, sir.
And
in my 35 years experience, every so often affiliate dealings prop up because there's huge economic incentives for them to, and unless they're prohibited, they have perverse effects on not just the behavior of the entities, but on the competitive nature around them, because generally affiliate transactions squelch competition, which benefits consumers generally, because you don't have the benefits of a competitive behavior when you have affiliate transactions that are not checked through RFPs, so you don't have the competition that healthy competition that is engendered from competing for opportunities.
So what your goal is to get to a free and fair market price? Is that that one way to say it?
Yes, that there's price discovery and there's price clearing in a fair and open process.
Transparent process.
Transparent process, yes.
Thank you.
After you've identified the need.
All right. And in terms of the need, how far out in the future you're trying to look?
That's an excellent question. Capacity additions are typically lumpy, so you want to look at something that will initially operate somewhere between 50 and 60% of load factor, and probably take 8 to 10 years to achieve 100%. And that's how you want to size it. You don't want to start below 50 to 60% load factor, and you want to make sure that you're going to meet that load, that you're not going to be back in a situation where your peak is more than 1.5 times your base by 10 years from now.
Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Whitfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Got one follow-up. I'd certainly like to thank you for being here again today, Mr. Lander. You've been a great witness. I feel like I'm back in economics class in college on supply and demand, and certainly you've given a good testimony on gas supply and gas demand. But real quickly, back to your discussion with Commissioner Hamilton about the Marcellus shale
Yes.
potentially being lower cost coming from the north, and traditionally we've had Transco and Southern bringing our supply in from the Gulf region. And with your recommendation of all this RFPs to, as you say, prohibit self-dealing, suppose that the Marcellus does end up being, if all the demand and supply things are as you described, and Marcellus does end up being the least cost, and it ends up being these
route.
Instead of self-dealing, it's synergies and the ratepayers benefited. Are you recommending any kind of RFP or any changes to arrangements with the supply for Transco and or Southern?
No, and here's why. There used to be, or first of all, at one point, when I first started in the business, the cheapest gas was in the Gulf, and the most expensive gas was in Appalachia.
Yes.
Okay? And over time, that's obviously reversed for the time being. It's entirely possible that it reverses again. The technologies that are able to exploit productively and economically exploit previously identified locations is why we have the Marcellus Shale. It's why we have the Barnett Shale. It's entirely possible that as technologies continue to evolve, we will find that in the Gulf Coast, there's another technological advance which advances that resource and causes that resource to become, less expensive.
Right.
Okay. So that's one point one thing I want to point out. Second, it used to be important to have geographic diversity because there was things called hurricanes that happened in the Gulf Coast because that was where we got 70 to 80% of our supply from. Now we're only getting about 20% of our supply from the Gulf Coast, offshore and near shore. And so the geographic diversity is no longer a driver, and we have geographic diversity already because gas is coming from the north, the south, the east, the west. And then there's another aspect of diversity called price diversity, okay? And there used to be reasons to buy gas in certain areas because it was priced favorably. And generally the price favorability had to do with periods of excess supply versus takeaway capacity. And so that was justified. And one of the things that happens, and I've watched this happen, I can't tell you how many times in the 35 years that I've been doing this, is, yep, there's a price diversity, but as soon as you build the pipe to relieve it, it goes away. At one point, the Rockies was priced $2 below the Henry Hub. They built Rockies Express. That went away. And the people who paid $1.45 for the capacity on Rockies Express all of a sudden had gas that was only 25 cents better off than where they were going to, at the other end. So they were spending $1.45 to get a 25-cent benefit. And that happens all the time with expansions. And that's why, but for the producer who signed up for that capacity, although they were paying $1 to get a 25-cent better price, the 25-cent better price was $2 better than they would have gotten otherwise. And so they paid $1.35, net $1.10 on the end. But at the beginning, they went up by $2. So actually, they went up overall by $1. So they got $1 better, even though they were losing money on the transport. They were getting $1 more on the first gas going in. And so when you see a pipeline being supported by producers who are pushing to market, they're making the bet that this is going to make me money. When you look at a pipeline that's bought by consumers, you really have to look and say, okay, well, what's the need that they're going to fill? Because if they're trying to just justify building or subscribing to a pipe for a price, the same thing's going to happen to them that happened to the producer. Only the difference is they're just paying more, meaning they're not getting a benefit. They're just paying more for the capacity and more for the gas. And so when it's a producer push, if the producer wants to put their money on the line and say, I'll sign the contract for 20 years, you can pretty much assume that they think that it's going to be better off for them. But when it's a pull, when the market is pulling it, you really got to make sure that there's a need that's being met because they're going to spend more for the capacity, and the price, when they put the capacity in, it's going to cause the price at the low price side to go up, because that's what happens when new capacity goes in. And so if they're meeting a legitimate need, even after the price has gone up and they paid for the capacity to get that price, that's okay. But if there's not a legitimate need, then there's a lose-lose-lose.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Lander. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Commissioners, anything? Commissioner Hamilton, your mic's on. Okay, that's good. Mr. Cleveland, any redirect?
Get us out of here.
You read my mind.
Mine too, Mr. Chairman. And thank you again. Mr. Lander, you were speaking with Ms. Edwards from ORS about your recommendation the company do a needs analysis. You spent some time looking through Dominion's practices in Virginia, correct?
They did have. Yes.
Did they do that analysis in Virginia?
No, they did not.
Okay. You were speaking with Mr. Whitfield, or Commissioner Whitfield, apologies, and he was asking you about possible conflicts between state and federal issues. Does your recommendation in any way intrude upon federal jurisdiction?
No.
Okay. What in fact happens under current practices is that the company goes out, signs a contract. The company then takes that contract to FERC. FERC approves it. They build the pipeline, spend all the money, and then sometime many years later, the company comes in for cost recovery from the customers, correct?
That's been the practice in a few places, and it's not the best.
And if that happens, the money is spent,
Yes.
and we are all going to be here litigating after the money is spent whether that contract was prudent.
That's the problem.
So billions of dollars get spent, and parties litigate prudency years later.
Right.
And you're just trying to avoid that, aren't you?
Yep.
Okay. You were speaking with Commissioner Hamilton, who said he was from the PD. If customers who are not SC&G, but industrial users or whoever, wanted the Atlantic Coast Pipeline to extend down into South Carolina and they were willing to pay for it, does anything you've recommended prevent that from happening?
Nothing.
Okay. You were talking about basis with Commissioner Hamilton as well. You've spent some time looking at Dominion's numbers, haven't you?
Yes, I have.
Does Dominion think that the gas coming through the Atlantic Coast Pipeline will remain cheaper in the future?
No.
Okay.
Our projections are that the price that they looked at originally, what they're currently projecting have gone down by 70%.
And you identified Atlantic Sunrise, Nexus, Rover, Rockies Express, and Columbia Gulf. So does the gas price go to market even if the Atlantic Coast Pipeline itself doesn't get built?
Yes.
You were speaking with Judge Irvin about self-dealing and synergies. Your goal, if the company implements the commission and the company follow your process, and they identify the proper need, and it turns out that the Atlantic Coast Pipeline is the right price for the right kind of need, does your process prevent the company from signing that contract?
No.
It just makes sure that they get it approved on the front end.
Yep.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, that's all the questions I have.
Thank you, Mr. Cleveland. That was borderline for you. Okay. Recross. Okay, thank you. All right. Mr. Lander, we thank you.
Sir.
You may step down and you are
Thank you.
excused.
Thank you for your questions.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Elliott, we good for the afternoon? Okay. Okay, good. All right, then. We'll come back at 1:27.